Development Program for Graduate Studies at Charles Darwin University. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies at Charles Darwin University, and welcome to this Touchstone Progressions session, Rescue Supervision. Right, we're going to talk about a topic that's rarely discussed. It is a reactive rather than proactive presentation. It is a topic or an area that is difficult, it's embarrassing, it's hurtful. The literature is really patchy on this topic, and I think it's patchy because it's such an embarrassment to every single university. So statistics are pretty difficult to find, and the trouble is it also gets mashed up with other problems and issues. Rescue supervision is a pejorative phrase and indeed a disturbing process. This phrase was rarely used or circulated in universities until about 20 years ago. A conference paper was delivered in Lisbon in May 2005 by Michael Briggs on rescue supervision. But like that middle child, the issues are ignored, and I think it's because people are made uncomfortable. Rescue supervision, although a relatively new phrase, refers to something that has always existed. Over 40% of PhD students have a change in supervision during their candidature, but a rescue supervision is a little bit different. Something has gone seriously wrong. It is the end of the road for the student. They're about to leave the program or being forced to leave the program because the supervisor has lost faith in them and or the project. If the project and the candidate is to survive, then they will have to be rescued. Why this is such a sad and disturbing situation is the sociology of the group that has to be rescued. So I have two facts for you. Firstly, students that complete their PhD and the students that attrit from their PhD are of equal intellectual ability. So in other words, something beyond the intellectual ability of the student is the reason for them to exit from the program. My second fact is derived from a longitudinal US study that students that are most likely to leave a doctoral program are students of colour, students with a disability, older students, Indigenous students, and yes, women. So both these facts show really the scale of what is happening and what is going wrong in our universities. So let me provide you with a bit of a qual moment, a true story. This is anonymised, obviously, but I want you to see this system. A woman in the health sciences in her early 60s comes to see me for her exit interview. She has formally withdrawn from the program. I meet with her to discuss what went wrong and to help her resolve for herself this ending, and yes, there are tears, and it becomes pretty clear that the thesis itself is nearly complete. But the supervisor said to her, quote, "There is nothing here. It's not really a research project," end of quote. I asked her if she would let me read the project. I do read the project, and it's clear that this is a research project, and with a little bit of attention could be a really great one. So 6 months later, this student submitted their thesis, and the story continues. The student receives, within that system, a double A. That is, 2 results that are passed without correction from 2 international examiners, 2 of the best scholars in the world. Okay. The story continues. The student then won the Vice-Chancellor's Award for Thesis Excellence. Okay, so how do we understand this turn of events? How does this happen and what went wrong? And then what went right, so we can see how we can all be part of this solution supervision rather than the problematic supervision that starts the whole issue in the first place. And of course, to be frank, this type of supervision destroys lives. But I want to frame our thinking on this issue in an effective and a pretty powerful conversation. And this conversation I held with an experienced supervisor, a very experienced examiner with a stellar supervising career, who all of a sudden, pretty late on in his career, started to see rescue supervisions and indeed started to become a rescue supervisor. He wanted to share the oddity of what he had seen in the last 5 years of his career. Now, what makes this interview with me pretty poignant, though, is that the man that you're about to listen to, the man you're about to hear, is dead. His name was Professor Steve Redhead, and of course I knew him via an accident of marriage. He recorded hundreds of podcasts with me, and this one is his last podcast. He summoned every bit of his strength, everything he had left in him before the pancreatic cancer got him. And he requested that the last podcast he recorded with me was on rescue supervision because he wanted to talk about it. He wanted to share with you what he had learned. And he also wanted to raise some significant questions for all of us as supervisors. Steve, I think, had some very, very good advice about not only what is happening and why it's happening, and that's important, but how to create the systems and the procedures when it does happen to make it effective and make this situation better. So this issue of rescue supervision worried Steve a great deal, so much that he made it his last public presentation. And yes, his voice is weak, but he had a really good go. So it seems appropriate that on this session that's so uncomfortable, so difficult, let's orient you into this disturbing field where the research is lacking, but the problem is increasing. So our guide through this very, very sad situation is a very experienced supervisor, and he's sharing his surprise about how the hell we got here. Good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, Tom.
And why you and I are doing this one in particular together is you and I didn't supervise at all together up till 2012, if you remember, when we were at the University of Bolton. And our first supervision together was the wonderful Lee Wright at Bolton. And if you remember, that was almost a rescue doctorate in and of itself. She was a woman who had, single mum, couple of kids, fantastic woman, brilliant woman, but had a career and was, in her 40s. And all these men were sort of saying, well, you're not really good enough, you can't really do a PhD. And, she'd moved through a whole series of supervisors and she, I was her head of department at the time. And we thought she was great. We thought she was terrific. So we took her on and while, the infrastructure of the university didn't even enrol her properly, we actually got her to finish her PhD. So it was this great situation where all these gentlemen of a certain age were saying, oh, look, we don't think you can do a PhD. And then we actually supervised her and she presented a completed PhD before they actually confirmed her enrolment. So, Steve, that was our first supervision together, and it was in many ways a rescue doctorate, rescuing the student rather than other supervisors or the institution. But during our career together as supervisors, which again we had 20, 30, 40 completions before we met each other, we've had a strange year. This last year we've had 10 PhD supervisions that we've taken on. We've had 10 rescue doctorates. Now that's incredibly unusual, and when we got this request on Twitter, Steve, I suddenly realised, wow, 2017 has been the year of the rescue doctorate. So, Steve, sociologically or historically, you can talk to me about this, the rescue doctorate. So why are rescue doctorates necessary? And do you think, what is going on with supervision right now that suddenly this is becoming an issue institutionally, perhaps?
I mean, I didn't even know it was a thing. How did this become a thing? The rescue doctorate. No, as you say, Lee Wright was the first one, I think, may have done one before that on my own. I've supervised to success, to completion, 37 PhDs. And in the majority of them, certainly in my early days, I didn't ever take over any students. There was no need to.
No.
There was no need to. And I've noticed, particularly in this last 12 months, where I have taken on quite a few, that these students certainly, it wasn't a matter of rescue. They were very good students in all their diversity. And quite honestly, I couldn't understand why they got to a point where they'd almost given up.
Yeah.
And that the supervisors maybe had walked away or whatever had happened.
Do you question their intellectual expertise? Do you question the intellectual ability of the student?
Yeah, I was stunned. I mean, sometimes maybe they were non-standard, which is, as you were saying about the Lee Wright case, and she was a very good student and passed at the University of Bolton, did a very good PhD, and we helped by installing some procedures, Stephen Torres' top tips, basically, which we have now refined and honed.
Yes.
And they work. I think they're tried and tested and they work. So I think that's quite an interesting issue. So maybe it is a matter of supervisors at whatever stage of their career actually having to develop their own style and maybe their own procedures and protocols for getting people through. And it's definitely different now. The PhD supervision is definitely different because you've got lots of people in non-standard positions. And you have to, as you've often said, supervise the whole family.
Yeah.
And I don't think supervisors are prepared to do that. And also I think supervision of PhDs has become something that they can just throw away.
Wow.
That isn't something that I ever experienced in my past universities and past history. I think something's happening in the PhD space.
Yeah, and if you take a student on, you commit to that, you commit to their family, you commit to them. And can I offer you a sociological point? And just so colleagues listening to this podcast understand the scale of this, Steve and I currently have 2 PhDs under examination. That's the scale of what we're doing. Both of those were rescue doctorates. We're currently drafting to completion. They're on actually my floor now as we speak. 2 PhDs that were rescue doctorates that we're going to get through in the next 3-4 months. In fact, I've got one other. So I've actually got 3 rescue doctorates that I'm getting through before May. So, and when I was asked to sort of think about this topic, when I was prepping the questions for us, Steve, I suddenly realised something, that there is a sociology to the students that we've, inverted commas, taken over from the rescue doctorate, and that is none of them are young men or women. Every single one of the supervisions we have taken over have been of men and women over the age of 40, and indeed in many cases over the age of 60. They've been interdisciplinary, they've been bright, as you've said, they have family caring responsibilities as well. A couple of them have an impairment or a disability, but the characteristic is none of them are the, inverted commas, bright young thing. None of them are under the age of 25. So in terms of the research I do on the deficit doctorate, and I've got a few pieces that are out and some more work coming in that area, that's quite significant to me because supervisors perhaps are seeing a version of their younger selves in the younger students, that actually they're able to get, oh yes, that's who they were. And so the modelling, the mirroring, if you like, of their past selves is accurate. But when a student becomes not a version of their earlier selves or their ideal selves, they panic and they don't quite know what to do. Have I been cruel there? I suddenly realised...
No, I didn't know the sociology. I hadn't thought about it that way. And we have actually got people through in this process. I think it's interesting to note that it's not only a matter of saying, oh, these people are really good, they're actually passed without any problem. So I do think there must be something going on here. Maybe it is that sociological profile. I mean, it could be that more mature students with all their relationships to family and so on that are very different to somebody in their 20s. are not prepared to put up with the kind of light touch supervision that very often goes on in universities now, in the neoliberal university, when PhD supervision is just a pain in the arse for a lot of people. And I think we have to say that.
Yeah.
So maybe it's that, but also I think it's to do with the institution itself. The neoliberal university is really kicking in now. I mean, it always is very strange to me that as neoliberalism fails in the world, in the globe...
fails in banking, fails in the economy...
It hasn't been seen to fail, or said to fail, in the university system globally. So I think maybe that is the kind of era that we're moving into, and that's why we need processes which soften the effects of the neoliberal university. And I think that's partly what we're doing with our protocols for students that we're, in quotes, rescuing.
Yeah, and it is a softer supervision. I mean, we are soft supervised. I mean, we're hard, we rely on standards.
Oh, absolutely, not standards.
We're very focused on standards, but we're soft in terms of we respect who the student is, we respect their journey, and most importantly, you and I respect intelligence. You and I don't care what package the intelligence comes in. We're very interested in intelligence, and the difference perhaps between you and I as supervisors is we actually read the work. So when a student approaches us and says, look, this has all hit the fan, my supervision's hit the fan, here's the work I've done so far. What I do for the wonderful podcast listeners out there is I print what the student has done out, and before I offer any commentary, I leave it for Steve to read. And I come home at the end of my work day and I say to Steve, what did you think of that thesis from Phil or Michael or Janine? And he goes, there's good solid scholarship there. There's very good scholarship there. There's no problems there at all. We can get this one to completion. And as I said, the weird thing is we've taken on these 10. Every single one of them is completed. Every single one of them has moved through examination easily. So the idea that supervisors were saying this person's not very bright, this person hasn't got the work, is wrong.
It is wrong. And I think the point about the protocols, for example, your argument about 10 reads.
Yeah, the 10 drafting iterations.
And things like that we've been able to implement successfully on a long-term basis, so it works. Those protocols are actually, of course, happening in the later stages of the supervision. In terms of rescue doctorates, we're taking over supervision at a late stage.
Yeah.
So the processes that we're implementing, which are the successful ones, are coming late in the piece. Whereas I think a lot of the time, supervisors get very frustrated. They're in themselves under a lot of pressure in the neoliberal university. And PhD supervision is the last thing on their mind. And therefore, if they can get out of that supervision, they often do. I think that's happening around the world. I really do. And that means all sorts of problems for university PhD supervision. But I think if they don't have these latter protocols, or ladder examination protocols, or ladder supervision protocols, even choice of PhD examiners, I mean, things like that are really important. If you don't have that, and I think a lot of supervisors simply don't even think about it, they don't know the processes, they will not get the students through, and that's when the student says, well, you're not doing any good for me, or the supervisor says, you're thick, you can't do it.
Absolutely. And so let's get into those challenges if we can. So from a student perspective, what are the challenges for students when they change supervisors?
I think the students, and obviously students around the world are listening to us on this podcast, I think you have to be very careful if and when you do change.
Boom.
I would always counsel against change, even though we've been talking about success here.
Well said.
So you've really got to go through, by talking perhaps with friends and colleagues or other people at the university, or in your case, Dean of Graduate Research, I think you have to go through a great deal in order to change. And I think there is a problem when people do change.
Yes.
So you've really got to have a lot of confidence. I think it's going to be difficult anyway if you change. I think the student has to understand that. It's not going to be a sudden fix.
Yeah.
It's not going to be a matter of other people doing the work for you, because a PhD, as I've often said on these podcasts, is something that is very lonely. I don't think you can ever get away from that. If you can't, and some people can't do it.
Yeah.
So the change in supervisor isn't going to change that.
That's right.
But it is going to change the whole relationship of supervision. You're going to have somebody quite different, with different protocols and processes. And it may work. And I think that's what, I mean, for example, that's what we found with some of our students who are producing some really excellent work. It was well worth doing.
All I'd say to him, a few things to say about that. Firstly, remember, Steve and I are pretty rare birds anyway, so we're both very, very experienced. We happen to be married, so that means we get on incredibly well. So you're not changing to two supervisors or a super that's not going to get on. We obviously get on, so we're a stable situation. We're also very experienced. We're used to working together. So the students are moving into an already existing system and paradigm of very experienced people. So whatever could have happened has happened to Steve and I. Can I say that's incredibly rare? So, you know, there aren't many husband and wife teams left in universities, and obviously they don't really exist in Australian universities because Australian universities don't want husband and wife teams.
No.
They don't want it. So this is an advantage that rarely exists in the system. Also, the other thing I say to students, Steve, is that changing supervision is a divorce, and I mean that seriously, it's that serious. And the thing is, if you're remotely happy in the former marriage, if you're remotely happy in the supervision, if there's anything going for it, then for God's sake, stay in it and finish it, right? But if you are in a marriage or if you're in a supervision and you are miserable and there actually is nothing going for it, then you have nothing to lose. You have to get to the point, I think, where you've got nothing to lose by changing supervision. And then you won't have regrets for whatever else happens after that. So you reach the bottom of the barrel, it's over, I'm so desperately unhappy, I just want to put my head in a toilet. When you get to that point, that's the time to change supervision. And as Steve said, come and see people like me, and people around the world love to have a chat with you. I've got the research on this, so I can tell you the strengths and the weaknesses via the research of what happens when you change supervision.
Yeah, I think that's the point, that there is an enormous amount now of higher education research, in which you're a leader internationally. And I think this isn't just kind of some subjective opinion, whereas it was in the past. Again, this PhDs were treated in a way which, had the staff room gossip basically around it, rather than higher education research. That's not true anymore. And therefore you can predict and help students by looking at the research. But I still think the student has to be very careful indeed. You're right about it's got to have reached the bottom of the barrel. But what the student doesn't want is to go on to another situation where they're going to have to change supervision again. And that I've seen lots of that.
Yeah, and so again, that's linked in. You don't want to sort of do the parallel to marriage, but then that's the rebound, isn't it? So like you leave one marriage, you've got no idea who you are, you've got no idea what's going on, you've sort of suffered this for 10 years, or 3 years in the case of a PhD, and then you bounce into what you think is going to be a better situation, and that person's a suicidal, homicidal maniac that belongs on a BBC thriller series. So you don't want to be doing that sort of stuff. You've got to know, and this is why I keep on saying to the students, don't have anything to do with anybody in a rescue doctorate that doesn't have an ability and form on rescuing students. So ask them, have you taken students on, and what happened to those students? Ask the question.
Yes, ask them. I mean, it reminds me really of the situation in the English Premier League soccer at the moment, where managers like Tony Pulis or Sam Allardyce, who's just gone to Everton. Tony Pulis has actually just gone outside the Premier League to Middlesbrough. But these managers, and they are actually British managers, who are on phenomenal salaries, they've actually become managers. They've rescue managers. In situations over the last 10 years, they've actually, if you actually top them up.
I mean, Big Sam.
Alan Pardew, Tony Pulis is the best example. But they're all people who've gone to various clubs in failing situations, and they've had protocols and processes.
They get the players fit, they get the strategy in place.
And then they've implemented them. And actually the club has stayed up in the English Premier League, which means a phenomenal amount of money for the shareholders. I do think it's a bit like that.
But can I say again, let's follow that metaphor through. It's not a long-term strategy for success. What it actually does, as happens in institutions, if you've got great rescue supervisors, that's great, we get the students through, but it's not addressing the systemic issue that caused the problem in the first place.
No,
so you can send in a rescue manager and they can keep the team up, but at the end of the day, the players weren't probably necessarily good enough to sustain it.
That's
All
exactly
the rescue manager did was get them fit,
yeah.
And Bobby Bank is a very different example
where
he was actually coming, but actually that was sustainable success because he knew what he was doing.
But for a while he was a lunatic.
Correct. But I think that's the point, that these rescue managers are great because they go in, they look at a bunch of players that are probably second or third rate, they get them fit, they keep the shape, they've got enough expertise and they're like, this is who we're playing next week, we're playing Spurs next week, this is their strengths and weaknesses, we can play to their strengths and weaknesses and we can draw.
But the trouble is that, and it's the same with the supervision, that the rescue managers need to be rescued by other managers. So Roy Hodgson, for example, is manager of Crystal Palace at the moment, replaced previous rescue managers. Yeah. And I think that's the problem with the supervision, although there are a lot of interesting parallels. So I think that the students need to ask the rescue managers about their experience and what they can offer. Yeah. So I think that's quite an important tip. Yeah. Don't just change for the sake of it. But you may well actually learn from those rescue managers.
Rescue supervisors.
Both, yeah.
Absolutely. and I think that's the point we're making. Maybe what I'm realising, and this comes from this wonderful query we got on Twitter, is this is a whole thing. This is a whole separate thing. This is a whole series of expertise that, and because we've done it, we've actually experientially done it because we're experienced. But actually you can be a fantastic supervisor and not be able to do rescue supervision. And that's my next question. And, I'm sort of living the pain of the last year, really. Why are the rescue supervisions so tough on supervisors? And by God, they are, Steve.
Probably because it's coming at a very late stage of the process. So, in some ways, the nicest bit of PhD supervision is in those early years because you're getting to know the student. You're actually, I think, privileged to be supervising students who are going to make a difference. They're going to make original contributions to knowledge if they get that PhD. And it's a wonderful world, really. Yeah. But eventually, the whole thing of reality kicks in. And you do have to finish. You have to finish it on your own. It has to be your work. And as I say, a lot of people panic. They can't do it, or they think they can't do it. And in some cases, they really can't do it. So supervision in that later stage anyway, even if you've been the supervisor all the way along, is going to be difficult. Yeah.
Well, can I say, let's break this down a bit. So why it's difficult, and again, this is experiential as much as we see some of it in the research literature, although can I say this is really undercooked in the research literature too. Right. But what I've found in the work we've done is you can't influence the methods. So you've got the student that already has the data set, the methods, they've configured their sort of theoretical perspective, and so the flaws in the supervision, the flaws in the research are there, right? Yeah. And we can't, you can't go back in the TARDIS and change the data set.
You mustn't do that.
And so you're working with some problems, okay? But I always treat it like an oyster with a pearl, okay? When you've got a rescue doctorate, okay, you know what? There is a bit of grit in the oyster. Yeah. So what you've actually got to do is say, you know what? There is grit in the oyster. There's some challenges in the methodology. There's challenges in the data set you've configured. You've missed this bit of the reading. Let's add this bit of the reading now. So you've missed this whole, somebody was a bit obsessed by phenomenology and they put you there, or they're a bit obsessed by others there, or frequently these days a bit obsessed by Foucault or Lacan, and it just means you've got all these blind spots that an examiner's going to pick up and go, dude, what the hell were you doing? So we can't correct the data set, the methods.
Yes. And you shouldn't.
And you shouldn't.
Don't do that.
And you shouldn't. But what you've then got to do, and this is the skill, I think, of the rescue doctorate supervisor, is go, okay, there is grit in the oyster. How do we put the problem into the work? How do we talk through the problem, put the problem into the thesis, make the problem in the thesis part of the argument? And where we've been incredibly successful is every single examiner of rescue doctorates that we've done, when we've had to do this and go, right, well, there's a bit of a focus on Foucault, and this is why there is a focus on Foucault, and you and I are not a big fan of Foucault. This is why the focus is on Foucault. These are the other options that are available, and so the student has to read a little bit more to put a context around Foucault, but this is the challenge of this. So we make them put the problem into the work, and every single examiner has picked up, wasn't that reflexive?
Yeah. And also the other thing to think about, I think, is that PhDs in a digital world are having to be more up to date than ever, especially bibliographically. I mean, if you can put into Google, the latest issues on, say, ethnography of the police or something. Yes. Whatever. We have a student doing this work at the moment. That reveals thousands, tens of thousands of journal articles that they could read tomorrow.
Yep.
So I don't think we've ever considered that in the past. How you make the most up-to-date PhD you can, and that's part of the thing.
Yeah.
Examiners can quite rightly turn around and say this stuff hasn't got anything in 2017. It's not good enough. So I do think, and we're back to protocols and processes which work. That is a really key thing, and very often, because the supervision has been fairly slow and leisurely over the years in PhDs, you get to the end and there's this phenomenal amount of material that you didn't, as a student, you didn't even know existed.
So here's a Tara top tip for you as a supervisor and as a student. One of the things we do firstly, when we take over these rescue doctorates, is I go to Google Scholar. Yep. I limit the search to 2017. I remove patents, I remove citations, and I put in about 8 terms from the research, really tight, specific terms, and I produce often about 120 or 150 refereed articles directly on that topic for 2017. We print them out and the student reads those. Yeah. And that makes the thesis look shiny and bright as a button, because I've got like 150 references from 2017 on the specific topic, and that's the gift of 2 things: digitisation, but also information literacy. Because I study and research information literacy, I've got a very good sense of the information scaffold, so I can save a student probably a year through information literacy skills and make it look shiny as a button, Steve.
And as I tell all our students, both of us, and I'm sure there are many other people when they're examining do the same thing, they read the PhD backwards. Yep. They read the bibliography first, and therefore that alone is something that can, if you don't do that as a rescue supervisor, you're not going to get the student through. And as an ordinary supervisor, I think increasingly people are not getting students up to date, and they're submitting something in 2017 which has the last reference in 2003 or something. I've seen lots of that. You just cannot do that.
No. And also the lagging of, if I can do the theoretical argument too, and this is actually my next question about techniques we'd recommend to supervisors who are taking over the cases. So obviously the information literacy one's important. Also lagged theory too. Yeah. So if former supervisors are not actually up to date, let's say theoretically, particularly, because theory is changing at the speed of light at the moment. It is unbelievable, and it's so exciting. As a supervisor, as a researcher, I feel like I'm just sort of grasping at the filaments of the excitement of theory. It is changing so quickly. It's so brilliant. We've got some of the most brilliant, interesting people, some people I've never even heard of, that are producing this fantastic work, and it's important that we all keep as up to date as we can.
Yes.
Now, if the former supervisors haven't stayed up to date, so they're using the same theoretical premises they used 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the theoretical world has changed, girlfriend. So the next thing you've got to do is look at the theory, and as I said, what you often see is a commitment, that's the supervisor's commitment to a particular paradigm or theoretical perspective, and they've read that scene perhaps without any awareness of the critiques of it.
Yes.
And so the anti-statism, I think, of Foucault is a great example.
Yeah.
So everyone goes on and on about agency, and actually, if you read the fantastic book on the neoliberal Foucault that arrived about this last year, I think.
Yes, exactly. I think one of the interesting things is that the supervisory role in general is changing, not just rescue supervisors. When I wrote Theoretical Times, my recent book, which is now out. I noted how the floodgates of theory had opened and, threatened to sort of drown us all, basically. Yeah. But the point about that, I mean, that's a bad thing in some ways for students because it's just overwhelming.
Yep.
But in some ways, you don't need a supervisor to say, go and have a look at Alain Badiou or Slavoj Žižek or whoever it might be. You don't need that at all. You can do it yourself, as you say, digitally.
Open access.
So that the PhD student's role in relationship to supervisor, particularly in terms of theory, I think has changed. Mm-hmm. And the best students are way ahead of their supervisors. Boom. Not just in the old way that eventually they become original contributions to knowledge and the experts. They are way ahead, the best PhD students. And that is actually by mastering the digital.
Yeah, and I've often referred to this, and in fact I've got a piece of thing I'm working on at the moment that I'll get out this month on the disintermediated doctoral student. Yes. So you're no longer reliant on the hierarchy of you need the supervisor to throw the crumbs from on high.
Yeah.
Actually, if you've got information literacy, and that's the key skill, and we've got multimodality, we've got open access environments, if you've got those crumbs from the supervisor, you can run with those crumbs and make a chocolate cake. Go do some damage, do some fantastic work. So from the supervisor's perspective for the rescue doctorate, we have to look at the methods, and if there are problems with the methods, you can't change the methods, you've got the data set, recognise the weaknesses and put the problem into the work, make the student aware of the problems and write through the problem so the examiner is cool with it. Theoretically, make sure it's up to date. Yeah. Bibliographically, make sure, my goodness me, 1/4 of the references are from the last 18 months. Boom, don't even muck about with that, right? What else? I think we also haven't talked enough, about the emotional situation here, Steve, that sometimes you're dealing with quite damaged students. When you're taking over a supervision, they're pretty messed up emotionally.
I think you are, but I think that can be exaggerated. I think, as a pessimistic northern Englishman, the PhD is something that probably you'll never... It's the hardest thing you're ever going to do. Yep. It's because you're on your own and you're having to climb this massive mountain and you keep falling off.
Yeah.
And that damages you. It does. I really do think it does. And you're in all sorts of emotional states as you go along in an ordinary environment for a PhD. So I think sometimes it can be exaggerated a little bit that the person who wants to change supervisors is in a worse position than the one who doesn't. I think it's just a general environment where certainly you, as a supervisor, whether you're a rescue supervisor or not, you need to be sensitive to that student's needs.
Yeah.
But I do think the other way is worth thinking about what I said before, that for students, for staff particularly, you don't really want rescue supervisors. What you want is a global system which runs pretty well and the supervisor stays on board and the student stays on board. That's what you want. And I'm saying that there are changes in the whole relationship of the supervisor to the student and the digital to the work, which is changing supervision in such a way that the supervisor should be able to stay on board a lot more in the future. I think that's the key. You don't want to get it to a situation where the divorce is there. But I agree with you, in some cases the students really are damaged and you have to do mostly sort of emotional rescue work.
Yeah, and also I'll use the divorce metaphor, it's about reclaiming trust.
It is, yeah.
So that's why the students have to do the work with the prospective rescue supervisor. Yeah. Is this person trustworthy?
Yes.
I often, I'll be a bit crude, I often have that argument, where I say to students, just make sure your supervisor is not a dickhead. Yeah. There is a dickhead quotient, right? Is this supervisor a dickhead? If they're not a dickhead, that's a good thing. So make sure the rescue supervisor is a decent human being and then trust them. So you've got to, because you haven't got a lot of time, you've got to build the trust as quickly as you can.
Trust is crucial. And I think trust is crucial in the whole supervisory process.
Yeah. I think you've rightly said trying to stop supervisors doing dummy spits is really where the problem only exists because supervisors have walked away. We need to stop supervisors walking away, and part of it is, I think, recognising the responsibility in tough times of being a supervisor.
And the enjoyment, the sheer enjoyment of working at a high level with a student who's going to make a difference. I think we should emphasise that a lot more than we do in universities, rather than the whole thing being a chore.
It's a privilege to supervise.
It is.
Full stop. Last question, and we've addressed it slightly. Let's make this crunchy now. How can the rescue doctorate be avoided? How do we render this system stable so that people like you and I don't have to take on 10 PhDs in a year and try and solve pretty difficult problems?
Well, certainly I think we have to do what you do and your office does, which is update training methods.
Boom.
Which sounds boring, but actually what it does is show that there is a change in the relationship between supervisor and student in this, the second decade of the 21st century. Things are changing. Things have changed. Supervision is, partly through digitisation and globalisation, is actually much better than it was in the past. I know we're picking out situations of difficulty, but I think the potential for good supervision, particularly with updates in training and studies in higher education itself, they should be showing us how much better and easier it is. I think we've just got to get on board. There are too many people who are living in the past in terms of supervision who have that old Oxbridge model, which at one time in the 1950s was fine, but that isn't the case anymore. Well, what do you put in its place? We've got possibilities of new models with lots of research backup, sort of things you show on your vlogs. It's astonishing what is out there. Let's just implement it.
Yeah, and if it does help, and again, I'm happy to share this with colleagues around the world that are listening to this, but how we've handled it is I've done a sort of video, it's a flip training, so they get a bit of content, but then what we do in the hour, which is just simply 1 hour in a lunchtime, so I'm not going to take people's time, is we look at scenarios. So if a student does this, or this student situation occurs, what are you then going to do? So we present 5 or so of those scenarios. So in real-time supervision, if this occurs, what are you going to do? And so you've already got a trajectory to move a student or move yourself out of this situation and to something better. So I think that the PD, has been really important.
I think it's absolutely crucial. And so you've got best practice. That's what the universities around the world should be doing.
Yeah. And the other point I'd just like to raise at the end, which is the bit of this that's torturing me. And as I said, I do a lot of work on the deficit doctorate and disempowered students from diverse backgrounds coming to PhDs. And this is a concern for me. So I think we as supervisors have to recognise that when students are arriving in our universities, they are whole people.
Yes.
We're not completing them. They are whole people with lives and loves and disappointments and challenges. And we can't supervise them as we were supervised.
No.
They're different from us. And that's my point that I endlessly talk about, which makes people crazy, which is the difference between experience and expertise. Experience is just you, and if I'm a white woman, you're a white bloke, right? Went to elite universities, probably supervised. You were supervised very well. I was supervised very badly. But we have presented a white face to the world. We were young PhD students, right? Now, supervising a 60-year-old Indigenous woman is different from supervising a 22-year-old white man.
Yeah.
And the question for supervisors out there to consider is, what theoretical perspective, what andragogy have you got to manage the differences in the student rather than imposing your stuff on very different students?
Yeah, I agree. And inclusivity in the neoliberal university, which we still have, is going to be very, very important. It's an incredibly important trajectory. Universities' rhetoric is, of course we want these students. But actually they haven't got anything in place a lot of the time to treat that person as a whole person. Yeah. And we've got to get onto that as quickly as possible, because that will stop the rescue doctorate.
Yeah. Steve, thank you for this conversation. How fascinating was this? We didn't even know this was a thing.
I didn't know it was a thing.
It's a thing. Thank you for sharing this session on rescue supervision. It is poignant and it is powerful, that an experienced supervisor shared as his last comment to colleagues his views on rescue supervision. It's up to us now to think about how this supervisory situation happens and how to be the supervisor that brings a student to completion rather than walking away from the candidature. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to Touchstones, our professional development program for graduate studies at Charles Darwin University.